This is the English language service of Free Radio Europe, a European voice in your home. Ukraine continues to resist. Mariupol is still being defended. The Russians are concentrating for a battle for Donbass. I bring you a guest who is very special and an authority on this subject. A veteran of Iraq, former commander of the 101st US Army Brigade, former commander of US Forces Europe, General Ben Hodges. Ben, welcome to the show.
Right. Thank you very much for the privilege.
Thank you for the time. You're joining us from Frankfurt. You spent many years in Germany, securing Europe, but also watching the Russian army. And so you have followed this in detail for years. And you were one of the people who thought that Putin didn't marshal enough forces for a proper invasion of Ukraine. And some people who thought that, well, being rational, he can't invade because he doesn't have enough forces. But he invaded anyway.
Well, of course, he overestimated his own capabilities. He grossly underestimated the resolve of Ukrainians to fight. And I think this is there's several reasons for this, but mainly it comes from arrogance and, it's just a gross mismatch of overestimation and underestimation.
Arrogance is one thing, but corruption on a huge scale must be another. He thought he had a fifth column in Kiev put together by the FSB, and it turned out that the FSB just stole the money, huh?
Yeah, well, and also I think about 150 members of the FSB have all been sacked, and the leader is now in jail. So that's the price of failure there inside the Russian Federation. What I have to admit that I was surprised a little bit that I overestimated Russian capabilities, even though I've been watching not close enough the last few years. But their failures are the result of 3 or 4 things. Number one, the corruption inside the ministry and inside the general staff is staggering. For example, they claim to have 900,000 troops. I doubt they have 500,000 troops. This is an old technique, though, for commanders to pocket money when they say, I need salary for this many, and they don't actually have people there. So the Russians, the first red flag was when they started advertising to recruit Syrians to come fight. I'm like, well, wait a minute. How could you already be running out of people? So that's one manifestation of the corruption. The other part, they've known for months that they were going to invade, but yet they issued rations to soldiers that had expired. This is incredible. I mean, that's another example of corruption, as well as just poor quality control or management of your resources, and that you don't give a damn about your soldiers anyway, that you give them expired rations. Maintenance, what Western armies, what the Polish army, the US army, the British army, what we all put into maintaining equipment, to include equipment that is in storage, because a vehicle that doesn't move anywhere actually breaks down.
There was this wonderful Twitter feed about how you need to move the tires of the trucks.
And so all these trucks that have tires that were rotten because they haven't moved. This is basic stuff. And so it tells you about the corruption inside the ministry.
But also they didn't seem to have delivered enough petrol for the original invasion force. I mean, Polish generals were telling me, Minister, the T-80 has with full outside tanks, has a range of 400-500 kilometers, even more. And they stopped out of fuel outside Kharkiv, 40 kilometers into enemy territory. Somebody either siphoned off or stole the fuel.
I think there's a combination of factors here. Fuel consumption, just like ammunition consumption, is always higher in combat than it is in training where things are very controlled. Plus, this is extremely cold weather, so I'm going to bet that these tank crews never turned off their vehicles in order to keep the heater going in the extreme cold weather. So again, consumption goes up. But also, there were reports of soldiers sabotaging their own vehicles, not wanting to fight. But I would also add this. The thing that I missed in my assessment was that they have no operational experience. It's been the same thin sliver of the Russian military that was in Georgia, in Syria, in Crimea, in Africa. So about 95% of the military actually has no real operational experience. For sure, they don't train to a rigorous standard the way that NATO armies do. And so you make mistakes about logistics. How much do you need? What's the consumption rate? And then, of course, vehicles being jammed together on roads. This is basic stuff that any good sergeant would correct. Of course, they don't have sergeants. So it's corruption, lack of operational experience, lack of rigorous training that has contributed to their performance.
But you must have analyzed the triannual Zapad exercises in detail, and they seem to be doing well in those exercises, and those were 30, 40,000 men exercises.
Okay, so it's a great question and opportunity. These exercises that they conduct, these are set piece, preordained, more like demonstrations. So, there's no risk of a tank doing a live fire on one of these exercises running out of fuel, for example, or out of ammunition. It's a very controlled thing. That's what I mean. They don't train against an opponent where it's a free maneuver battlefield the way that we would at our National Training Center, or here in Germany at the training center in Hohenfels, where the enemy usually wins most of the time in exercises. Now, this is a cultural thing too, where a commander is allowed to fail in an exercise. You train to the point of failure. You want to find where all those weaknesses are. An athlete would recognize this as training to muscle failure. You can be sure that Zapad, there is zero muscle failure happening in an exercise like that.
As a professional, would you say that assault on Kiev was well planned? Because it seemed to me like it was just a mass of equipment designed to intimidate rather than fight, on the assumption that there would not be actual resistance.
Look, first of all, to answer the question, of course, it was not well planned. I don't think they could have encircled Kyiv if there were no Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, Kyiv, as you know, is a very, very large city. It's divided by one of Europe's largest rivers at its widest point. And it's not like Manhattan where all the roads are north, south, east, west. I mean, it is a very complicated, or what we would call complex urban terrain, huge numbers of very large buildings. And we know from experience that it takes a lot of soldiers to clear a large apartment building. I mean, like an entire battalion of soldiers to clear a very large apartment building. So wow. Just the idea that they could get in there that fast is ridiculous, and they didn't have enough people. And this is why it's also important to study history, and certainly Poles know their history. In 1943, when the Red Army had launched its counteroffensive against the German Wehrmacht in the Dnieper River campaign, they used 700,000 troops to capture Kyiv, and it took a month. So that's why I was fairly certain.
And here the land component of the Russian invasion was only about 120,000 on all three directions together.
Yeah, that, you know, when I was hearing people say, "Oh my God, they've got 120,000 people," I'm like, wait a minute, Wembley Stadium holds 90,000 people. I mean, University of Michigan Stadium holds 104,000 people. That's not enough if you're invading a country that's twice the size of Germany, that will have a determined defense. So it really was just some very, very poor planning and estimations.
Shoigu likes to parade in a uniform, but he's not actually a military man, is he?
No. And also, he's been there for 8 years in post, so he's not going to be able to escape responsibility for this catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainians have won the Battle of Kiev. Putin's plan A has failed. He has not changed regime with minimal losses. He has not brought all of Ukraine back into the fold with a quick and easy operation. That's gone.
Yeah. I don't want to overstate this, but I imagine in years to come, people are going to compare what Ukrainians have done to the Polish miracle on the Vistula. I mean, this is very few people predicted it, that they would destroy the Russian attack the way that they've done. It's interesting. Also, there's some other longer term aspects to this. General Gerasimov. People talk about the Gerasimov doctrine and like this is some kind of Sun Tzu sort of thing. I think the only Gerasimov doctrine that people are going to talk about in the future is the murder of innocent civilians, because these are his soldiers. Now, he will not be able to say, those were subordinate commanders. So one day when there is a trial in The Hague or whatever, he's going to be sitting there in the docket with a set of headphones listening to the prosecutor.
What would be your hypothesis? Were they behaving like that on orders, or is it an unspoken deal between the politicians and the Russian military? We don't pay you much, we treat you really badly, but when you get to the enemy territory, you can let you can let loose, which is how European armies behaved until about the beginning of until the Napoleonic Wars. And then they found that it was not just criminal, it was counterproductive.
Exactly. So this is who the Russians are. I mean, they've never been known for a soft touch. And so destroying cities, a medieval approach, deporting and kidnapping and deporting people in an attempt to depopulate. I mean, this is what they did. The Soviets did between the wars. It's what Russians have done for centuries. So I don't imagine that Gerasimov said, okay, I want you all to go out there and feel free to kill everybody you want to. But culturally, it would have been accepted or maybe even expected, especially when you talk about if you accept the idea that the whole objective of the Russians was to eliminate Ukraine as a state, even the idea of Ukraine as a state. So you start depopulating, you destroy every shred of infrastructure. I mean, Mariupol was once a significant port. It'll be years before that place can be a port again. So
that's particularly odd, isn't it? Because Mariupol is a Russian-speaking city, and the inhabitants there thought, they will not be so hard on us because Mariupol is a ghost town.
Yeah, this shows me that this is all about destroying the idea of Ukraine, so that there's no economy, there's no nothing. Already down in regions outside of Kherson and Zaporizhia, they're forcing people to use rubles for
rebuilding Lenin statues, which
yeah. So this is the long-term goal. So the idea that they're soldiers, and by the way, if soldiers are undisciplined, they're more likely to commit crimes. So and what we have seen, it's so much evidence of poor battlefield discipline. And so it's not surprising that these same soldiers would not have any problem murdering innocent people.
There are some conversations picked up by the security services of Ukraine between soldiers and their relatives, in which the soldiers claim, I wonder whether this is true, that because it's not technically a war, they can't actually be forced to fight. They can just be expelled from the army, that there is no martial law. Interesting.
You're talking about Russian soldiers?
Yes.
This has been interesting for me. The Rada changed the Duma changed the law just before 24 February to allow conscripts to go outside of Russia into Ukraine. So there are legal aspects that seems they pay attention to some, but not all. And I think that the General Staff probably is concerned about the impact on the population if they do violate certain laws, particularly about conscripts. I was surprised recently to learn that they made the decision not to mobilize reservists, for example.
Right.
That tells me that there's not a phase 3, because they don't have enough troops to finish what they think they're going to do now. And then,
which is amazing. I mean, Russia always had, inferior technique, but huge numbers, and they seem to have run out of the numbers, huh?
Yeah. Well, of course, the population of Russia is about 150 million, it's a very unhealthy population. And you know, of course, that when it was the Soviet Union, they would bring in troops from all the different Soviet republics. That's not happening now. So, and the Kazakhs, they're saying, no, we're not interested. Even Belarus is like, you can base out of here, but we're not sure we want to join this. So the fact that they turned to Syria asking for bodies, and they're bringing back some old Wagner mercenaries to find enough troops.
And the Russian soldiers seem to be from the poorest part of Russia, which is why they are so impressed by Ukrainian homes, yeah, and why there is so much looting.
The best meme I've seen so far showed one of these Turkish-made drones flying near the Moskva, the ship that sunk, with a washing machine suspended under it as the distraction.
There is the film of a parody of the 9th of May victory parade with Russian soldiers, you know, carrying again washing machines and stolen carpets and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's been a lot of creative humor come out in the last couple of months.
What reserves can Putin still put into this fight?
Well, I think that they are brutal and they're medieval, but they're not stupid, and so they will.
And they learn.
That's right. They will have learned certainly some things from the last 7.5 weeks. They won't be able to fix all of them, but I imagine that they are looking everywhere for any able-bodied soldiers or former soldiers. You know, they're recruiting people up to the age of 60 to be truck drivers. But again, it still impresses me that they decided not to mobilize their reservists. And I think that probably is an indication of their concern about impact on Russian society, because then that'll reveal the lie about what's going on. But also, I think they realize their chances for going all the way to Odessa, for example, or reattacking in Kyiv, that's not going to happen this year. I think
Odessa is not doable anymore.
No.
If they can't do the assault from the sea and they haven't captured the bridges on the southern Bug, they can't take Odessa.
No.
Not doable.
No.
So what is doable is Donbass. And
it's more feasible for them to try that. But I think, you know, Ukrainian troops are well prepared for this, what's coming next.
Well, they are prepared on the line of contact, but they are threatened with an enveloping movement from the south and the north.
But that would require, yes, but that would require Russia to all of a sudden magically have fixed all their problems, that now they can somehow launch effective coordinated attacks. And of course, as you know, this part of Ukraine, this thick black dirt, when it gets wet, it is very difficult. And
I traveled to Mariupol 10 days before the war.
Yeah.
And we traveled for 3 hours from Dnipro to Mariupol. And I thought, this is not a good topography for defense, because you have these huge kolkhoz fields that go for 10 kilometers with hardly a tree, hardly a brook. Very difficult to set up a line of defense there.
I don't know if I agree with that. I flew over that terrain myself just a few years ago, and it was like flying over the middle of Kansas, you know, just totally flat and fields. But I would not want to be a tank driver or a driver of a Russian BMP in this fight, because these javelins that can reach out several kilometers, they are going to light up, because the tanks will also be very exposed. And the Russians have so many problems, so many weaknesses. They will not be able to fix these in time if they really hope to do an attack within the next 3 or 4 weeks. And I think that the ground is going to be wet from rain. And even though it may be big and open, the springtime is not ideal for trafficability for the armored vehicles.
The Russians delayed their offensive too much, huh? Perhaps, I mean, just like Barbarossa started too late because of Yugoslavia, this started too late because of the Beijing Olympics. They should have started 2 or 3 weeks earlier, huh?
I think they're probably kicking themselves right now. They with every day that they waited, Ukraine got better and better. We learned more and more. I do want to say, by the way, I thought the Biden administration did a great job on the sharing of intelligence before that attack. I've never seen
of strategic intelligence, which the Ukrainian army believed, but the president didn't. And, I was meeting officials, everybody except him, and I was asking them 10 days before the war, why aren't you mobilizing your economy for wartime production? You should be producing ammunition now 24/7.
Yeah. I think this was one of the major mistakes that the Ukrainian government made before this. But what I was about to say is I was impressed that first of all, with the diplomatic effort by the Biden administration, more intensive diplomatic effort by a U.S. government probably since 1995 and the Dayton Peace Accord. And then the decision to share intelligence like they did really impressed me. Intelligence people, they don't like this because they don't want it to be known what we know. But here, I thought it was brilliant. And the fact that none of our European allies pushed back on it tells me that the administration shared it enough.
But you know what happened with the German intelligence chief?
No.
He was in Kiev the day before the invasion, telling the Ukrainians it will not happen, and then had to be evacuated the next day.
And then the French intelligence chief also was unfortunately was sacked after this. But my point is, after 20 years ago, the Bush administration said we have proof of weapons of mass destruction. So I could understand if our European allies would have been skeptical. So that means that the administration this time showed them and shared with them, here's what we have. Nobody pushed back on it. That was impressive.
So that was the strategic use of intelligence, but there is also the tactical use of intelligence, which must be gold dust for Ukrainians. They know exactly where the Russians are and what they're planning.
Yeah, I think that, of course, when you talk about tactical intelligence, there's a lot that's shared that we won't necessarily know about, nor should we know about it. But I am confident that what we're seeing, much of this is a result of cooperation between U.S., Canadian, European intelligence services and the Ukrainians on identifying capabilities, things, targets, and that would be part of why Ukraine has been so successful. There's never too much, though. I mean, we've got to keep doing this because right now, this window of vulnerability where the Russians are trying to rebuild, reconstitute, they're very vulnerable. And we should be pushing everything that would enable Ukrainians to hit these deep targets because that's what's causing all the damage and killing so many civilians.
Artillery and rocketry, huh?
Exactly. And also where these units are trying to rebuild. I mean, they're bunched up. There's fuel. There's ammunition everywhere. That we should be hammering the hell out of those targets.
You mentioned the Battle of the Vistula, and what happened there was that our commander-in-chief at that time took the risky decision of allowing the Bolsheviks to come to the gates of Warsaw. He then removed his cavalry and some of his forces south, where an opening between two Bolshevik armies was created, counting on the fact that the defenders will hold out for a few days, and then attacked from the side, from behind the Dniepr river, across the Bolshevik supply and communications lines, which is your classical Napoleonic tactics, right? And then the enemy panics, and then you rout them. You destroyed most of them while they are withdrawing in a panic. Is there a possibility that now that the Russians have taken Izum, hoping to go south, the Ukrainians, if they could marshal the forces, could strike between Izum and Kharkiv?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And I'm sure that the Ukrainian general staff is trying to figure out the right moment, the right place to do something like this. Of course, they're helped by the fact that Russia has failed to integrate their air power with their land power. This becomes a lot more dangerous if you've got Russian aircraft and Russian drones up in the sky that can see armored formations trying to move to launch such an attack. But if they're able to avoid being hit or discovered by Russian air power, then I think they'll have some success here. But this is also why the idea of pushing to the Ukrainians more armored vehicles, things they could use for this, is also important.
What we've seen is that the bulk of the Russian army is essentially a 1980s Soviet army, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Poorly integrated among the services, and also suffering from the same kinds of problems that the U.S. Army suffered in the 1980s. Yeah, I remember the famous story about, during the invasion of Grenada, of an officer calling in for artillery support with his AT&T card. Huh?
Yeah, we've learned a lot the hard way over the decades, and in fact, you'll probably remember it took the U.S. Congress passing a law called Goldwater-Nichols to force us to play together, to be joint. There is no such thing in Russia, and so it's, in a way, it's not natural. Each service tends to want to do its thing, and that's why we've seen no amphibious operation that supported ground maneuver anywhere, even though the Russians had total control of basically the Black Sea and Azov Sea. They've not been, other than shooting missiles into towns and killing people, they have not been able to do anything with their Navy. Most of their Air Force has actually stayed inside Russia because it was so dangerous for their pilots. And look, a pilot has to spend a lot of time in an aircraft and in a simulator to be proficient just to keep it level, let alone, talking about supporting ground operations, worried about enemy radar and all that. So the training of their Air Force is also in the same poor state that their land forces are.
But also, they just don't have enough precision munitions, do they? They don't have JDAMs. So they can only give ground support by going very low. And they can't go low because of stingers.
Yeah, there is that. Interestingly, one of the very positive side effects of these sanctions is that many of the critical components that Russian defense industry depended on to make smart bombs, precision munitions, are no longer coming in. So they cannot replace the huge amounts of missiles and rockets that they've already fired. So they've lost there. In fact, they cannot even build new tanks because, again, some of the components that they need came from other countries. That's all stopped. So this is, I believe that they're going to culminate, that they are not going to be able to achieve all that they want. And that's why I think, Radek, it is so important that we don't let this opportunity pass to break their back now while they are literally on their knees trying to get back up. Let's don't wait for them to get back up.
My wife was in Kiev last week, spent 90 minutes with President Zelensky, and in her Atlantic article about it, the most memorable phrase from President Zelensky is, "I feel like I'm inside Groundhog Day. Leaders ask me, what do you need? And I tell them, I need the same things I told you about a week ago."
Right.
This, speed is of the absolute essence here.
Yeah. We don't need any more lists. We already know everything. There are so many lists flying around. We know exactly what they need. And it's the capability to strike deep, to hit the rockets and artillery and whoever's firing missiles, whether it's airborne or from ships, into Ukrainian cities. That's what's needed, that capability. That includes intelligence, that includes counter-fire radar, but the systems. That's why, of course, provided 18 howitzers is good, but that's basically 1 battalion of artillery, right? And 40,000 rounds will go very fast. So it's about finding, number one, ammunition for the systems they already have, which we probably could find in most East European countries. But also we need to be thinking longer term. Give them the Germans, the Americans, the Swedes, and I think Norwegians have, the French have long-range artillery and rocket launchers. Give that to them. We'll pay later. Push those capabilities to them now. We have a window of about 3 weeks we can really inflict so much damage on Russia that they will not be a threat to their neighbors for years. But if we let them get back up, then that window of opportunity is going to pass.
But I assume that Zelensky dared to give a snub to President Steinmeier because Germany has in fact not delivered what it announced.
Yeah, I have to say, I've looked at this from 2 or 3 different angles. First, I can understand his frustration and the frustration of all Ukrainians that Germany has been so slow to really grip this and to lean into it. But on the other hand, I think, President Steinmeier, he represents Germany. He is Germany. And Ukraine needs the EU. Ukraine needs Germany. I mean, there's going to be life after this. And it's going to take a massive rebuilding effort. And you can be sure that Germany and the European Union are going to be right in the middle of all of this. So I think probably not the best move here in this case. But again, I can understand frustration. And to be candid, President Steinmeier, I mean, for him to publicly admit, hey, I was wrong for 20 years. That's not inconsequential. And I think Ukraine could have handled that better.
You may or may not know that I brought out the first pictures of Stinger missiles on the battlefield in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And you know what's strange for me is that it's against Stingers, against the same Mi-24s. And that weapon changed the course of that war because, as we were saying, the helicopters, from giving close air support and from delivering stuff to isolated garrisons, had to go high from one day to the next. And that meant that the Soviets had to double their contingent or quit.
Right.
Now, I put to you, but you correct me because you are the US general, there is a weapon that you have that could have a similar effect, that you have in store, plenty of. It's called CBU-97. It's essentially an anti-tank cluster bomb. Launched from afar, and 40 separately targeted submunitions, designed for stopping a Soviet offensive across the German plain. I'm told it was used once during the Iraq War, and it destroyed half an Iraqi tank brigade, and the other half came out of the turrets and gave up. And I'm also told, reliably, I've checked this with the producer, which is Textron, that it is ideally launched from an F-16, which has the software, but it can also be launched from a MiG. What'd you say?
Well, I think as long as this is in compliance with whatever agreements we have signed about use of cluster munitions.
But this is anti-tank. This is not anti-personnel.
Yeah, but that's not the point. If there's a dud rate, a certain, you know what I mean by dud rate, a failure rate below or above a certain number, you can't use it. And I think in this case, right, you know more than I do, but that was the first thing I thought of is like, okay, is this in compliance? Because previous administration or the Obama administration had agreed that we would not use this, but I'm a little dated on this. For sure, if there's not a legal problem, then of course we should be emptying our depots to provide.
I'm told you have 6,000 of these things in storage. They're no longer produced.
You're going to make me do a little bit of homework here. Now, look, CBU,
97. It's called sensor-fused weapon.
One of I saw one of the listeners raised a good point. We can't just assume that everybody in Poland and Romania and Czech Republic and Baltic countries should all just give up all their ammunition and weapons to go to Ukraine. Of course not. And I think in this case, the United States, Germany, UK, France, Italy should be stepping forward to say, look, Ukraine needs what you have. We will back you up. We will provide, just like the United States sent, Patriots to Slovakia as well as Poland. There's other things we can and should be doing. There are like 6 different U.S. Air Force squadrons in Europe now. It's a significant increase of what we would normally have.
Another Putin success, huh?
I'll be in Finland next week, by the way, so I'm looking forward to seeing another success of President Putin.
This is interesting, the Finnish and possible Swedish application to join NATO. Isn't this something we could play with? We could say to Putin, look, you wanted to stop the enlargement of NATO. One is about to happen unless you withdraw.
I suspect that would be compelling, but I think we've got to be consistent on the principle. If a nation wants to join, the alliance, then they should be able to apply, which is what we had said for
apply. But we don't have to admit them. I mean, this is our decision. And of course, Sweden and Finland would enhance. Finland is great on the mobilization side. Sweden makes some very good armaments itself. They would both contribute, but it would affect Russia's security. Finland is close to St. Petersburg. Russia's border with NATO would expand by 1,200 kilometers.
Yeah, well, you know what? Vladimir needs to be thinking about that when he's sitting in his study or at his big mansion looking out over the Black Sea, realizing what a colossal mistake he has made by not only motivating Sweden and Finland to seriously consider NATO membership, but also turning 44 million Ukrainians against Russia. I mean, not to mention his own economy being wrecked for years. So
sure,
this will be.
But you know what my theory about that is? That the interests of Russia and the interests of Putin are not aligned.
I completely agree.
Because the interest of Russia is to be an ally of the West in order to protect Siberia. And the interest of Russia would have been to play nice to Ukraine and hope that over the long range, Russian culture, which was very popular in Ukraine and all kinds of economic links, would create some kind of synergy and influence. And the interest of Russia would be now to end this war and get out from under the sanctions. But the interest of Putin is to stay in power. And what I fear is that he may be calculating that a bad long war is better for him than a bad peace.
That's plausible. He would certainly be exposed to an awful lot of pressure and criticism if people,
which is hard while the war is still going on.
Right, and it certainly appears that an awful lot of Russians believe and support. And I'm not talking about the old people that still live out in the middle of Russia that only get state TV. I'm talking about Russians that live here in Germany, all over Europe, that also where they have access to 24/7 news from hundreds of sources, and they still believe what the garbage that's coming out of the Kremlin. So, I think getting the truth to Russians is just as important as getting weapons to Ukrainians. So, a concentrated, long-term effort to help change the thinking there. Now, that would mean that the United States, we would have to live up to our own talking points. And I think that our own domestic political challenges over the last few years have made us vulnerable and also less effective.
You know what? Russians who believe the Kremlin are not going to believe our sources of information. I think the most effective way of reaching the Russians is to enable the Ukrainians what they're doing anyway, which is a campaign of Ukrainian Russian speakers calling their friends and family in Russia and telling them like it is.
That's what I'm talking about, is a comprehensive effort. I mean, there are millions of Europeans from Norway all the way around to Georgia that have Russian family members, business contacts, friends, you name it, millions of them. And they should all be doing what they can, trying to explain what's happening. Now, I've talked to several people that have tried this, and they said it's just unbelievable that the resistance they get. So it's got to be a combination of information, and especially using a lot of the Russian intellectuals and media who have left Russia. They know how to communicate to Russians. Let's get them on the case. But also, again, our own domestic political challenges with liberal democracy it damages our effectiveness in this case.
Yeah. So how does this end?
Yeah. Well, here's how it's going to end. Ukraine is going to win. They're going to win this. By that I mean, at a minimum, they have stopped Russia from accomplishing almost any of its objectives. That, at minimum, is what's going to happen. Russia has for sure lost the peace. Nobody in Russian government's going to be welcome anywhere anytime soon. Their economy is wrecked. We've learned so much about dirty money in all of our countries now. We've learned a lot about different things because of the sanction efforts and so on. Plus, countries are starting to look at, obviously they need energy from places other than just Russia. But what I would like to see from my government's administration, is to start talking about winning. And I think that winning means, number one, all Russians back to the pre-24 February line. Number two, every Ukrainian that was kidnapped and deported is brought back home immediately. Number three, a long-term commitment by the United States and the rest of the alliance to eventual full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. That means Crimea and Donbass. And then number four, we break the back of Russian military capabilities so that they can no longer threaten Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia.
The military capability is one thing. We in Central Europe knew in our bones that something bad was coming when Putin restarted this mix of Tsarist and Soviet ideological teaching of history in Russian schools, and when Russian media started brainwashing people into this ideology that gives Russia the right to rule over other countries. I mean, we know that desovietization was not possible because Russia didn't lose the Cold War in the same way that Japan and Germany lost the Second World War. But in the end, it's what leaders have in their heads, which makes them use this equipment in an aggressive way, isn't it? This is what we need is political transformation of Russia, don't we?
Yes, and so this argues for what we've tried to do in the past with cultural exchanges, education, and these sort of types of programs. But we also thought that, well, after the end of the Cold War, that once Russia became capitalist and everybody started, enjoying all that obviously democracy would follow. Well, we were wrong, because as you know, democracy is not just a policy change. It's got to be based on cultural foundations about individual liberties, about a free media, about a court system, and equality. None of that exists in Russia, not in the way that would be necessary for a liberal democracy. So I think that if we made a mistake in the aftermath of the Cold War, was that we overestimated the ability of Russia to make that sort of or even the desire of Russians to make that transformation.
I'm not sure, because Putin was blowing hot and cold. Putin is the first leader of Russia who came to Katyn. Putin is the first leader of Russia who came to Gdańsk and acknowledged that that's where the Second World War started, which for him was not nothing, because it goes against the grain of Stalinist version of history. We had our own reset with Russia, which was somewhat successful. We had a visa-free agreement for the Kaliningrad Oblast. Above all, our historians agreed the facts of history with Russian historians. That's not nothing. My theory is that Putin The potential was always there, and we all had pretty much the same policy, namely hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. Encouraging Russia to be integrated, but also preparing to defend ourselves if need be. And then I think Putin made the final flip in his mind to be our enemy, because it was he who decided that.
Yeah.
After 2011, after the demos in Moscow and St. Petersburg against him reassuming the presidency, and he blamed it on us, and specifically on Hillary Clinton, and he decided that we were trying to do regime change in Russia, and then he decided that he therefore needs to secure his own backyard. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't challenge any of your assessment there. He also started a military modernization in 2007 in anticipation of some point in the future being prepared for a conflict that he may or may not start. But I mean, when you start putting that much money into your military, stand fast the corruption, it's for a purpose. Sure. And I think that the professionals on the general staff knew that the safest part of their border was actually the part that touched NATO. That was the one place where we could guarantee they were never going to be attacked. But yet he needed to generate the idea of a threat from NATO in order to justify doing what else he was doing. I think your assessment of when he sort of flipped is probably a good one, but it also would be tied to when he thought his military might be close to being able to start doing things that he wanted to do.
I don't buy his narrative about him having to do this because of NATO expansion, which, as you know, is shared by some so-called realists in the United States. Because what he had was that in 2008, we didn't give Ukraine membership action plan for better and for worse. And what he had was the Chancellor of Germany telling him in Moscow and confirming publicly that he will block Ukraine's application on his watch. And he may be Chancellor for 10 years. So what Putin had in his hand was a moratorium on Ukraine's membership. So it doesn't make sense to me that somebody has to launch a war on the hypothetical possibility that Ukraine might be able to successfully apply in 10 years' time or later. That just doesn't make sense.
No, I think there's something pathological about Ukraine for him that to erase it as a state, or the idea of Ukraine as a state. And that's played out. I honestly thought before the attack, I was seeing the intelligence too, the public intelligence. I did not believe he would really attack the way that he did, because I thought he could accomplish all of his objectives without having to actually invade, without casualties and without sanctions, because the pressure of all of these troops all around Ukraine, the Navy, the huge buildup on the north of Ukraine, it was already beginning to have an effect on the Ukrainian economy. And so I thought, if he does this like a boa constrictor, wrapping itself around Ukraine until Ukraine's economy collapses, then the Zelensky government would collapse. And then he gets his own guy in there and he's accomplished what he wants without getting a single sanction or losing.
Which would have been the rational plan, which is what Zelensky thought he was doing. Which is why he didn't believe the invasion was coming.
Exactly. And so I think that's why I think that there's more than just, I want to make sure Ukraine is not in NATO. He wanted to punish Ukraine. He wanted
Ukraine, just like the Bolsheviks, yes. Because without Ukraine, Russia is not it doesn't have a chance to be a superpower.
Right.
I knew, and this is my just last couple of sentences. I knew he would do it when I read that essay in July last year, and when I learned that he ordered all his professional military to read it. I asked myself, well, why would you do that? There's only one way: is to motivate people, is to explain to them why you're invading.
Getting them ready. That's right. Preparing the population, preparing the troops.
Yeah. My last question to you as a professional: Is this the end of the era of the tank?
Absolutely not. This is a reminder of what happens when you don't have properly trained and properly employed armored forces. I'm not a tank guy myself. I'm an infantryman, but I always want lots of mobile protective firepower around me because of what it can do. But these tanks that the Russians are employing are getting lit up because they're employing them so poorly. They're untrained, and it's
without infantry support, huh?
Yeah, we've all seen the videos of these tanks, a cluster of them going through a village, and they're just getting hammered. That's the exact opposite of how they should have done that. If you have to go through a town, you got infantry out and making sure that you don't have javelin gunners off in the wood line to the side. So again, lack of operational experience, lack of proper training, lack of sergeants.
But the basic design of the tank needs to be changed, doesn't it? With the thinnest armor at the top, when all these missiles are now designed to hit from the top.
Oh, look, this has been going on for 100 years. You know, you do this, then the other side does this, and so that's why you now have top attack weapons. But I think the next developments we're going to be seeing are not to get rid of tanks, but if you can reduce the weight, that's one thing, which means if you have no troops up in the turret, if you're able to operate the gun without having to have people up top, you can save 20 or 30 tons just from that. And I think we'll also start seeing more, not autonomous, but robotic. You know, you still have the track, you still can move, it still can shoot, but you don't have people in it. So it can be a lot lower profile. And you know, you have to train on how to reduce your signature. These guys are out in the middle of the open. I've seen zero evidence of any Russian tanks being camouflaged or doing things to reduce their signature. So they pay the price.
General, I'd like to thank you not only for our conversation, but above all, for your many years of service in NATO for the sake of European security, not just your own country's security. We are very grateful. We are very pleased that you are here in Europe, that the United States has rallied round, that we have the 82nd Airborne in Poland in our time of need. Thank you very much, General Hodges. Thank you very much, USA.
Thank you. Thanks for this privilege, brother. Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.